To get us started with today, we're gonna review what we would have covered so far, and I think we would have started from, let's see, we stepped up to autofill. So, alright, let's start from there. So, can anybody tell me, what does the term block range refer to?
Sir, it's a group of cells.
A group of cells, right? So a group of cells, I think I would have asked that the last time. Now, how many entries does the clipboard have?
Sir, 24 max.
24. Good, yeah, I remember asking that also. Good. When you see hashtags in a box, what does that mean?
Sir, it means the cell is full.
The cell is full, you can say that.
Sir, it's too small to hold the information.
It's too small to hold the information. That's more accurate. So it's too small. Actually, no, you cannot say the cell is full because technically the cell isn't full because you can still enter more data. Just that it is too small for you to see the information. Good. Yes, it's too small. All right. What is autofit? How would you describe autofit?
Sir, automatically resizing the space.
Okay, I would take
Sir, to the largest character.
okay, automatically resizing what?
The cell.
The cell, only the cell?
Sir, the entire column or row.
Exactly. The entire column or row. Because if you look at it, it's not just one cell you are resizing. It's not just one cell. Whenever you resize something, it's not just one cell you're resizing. You're resizing an entire column and you're resizing an entire row. So it's not just one individual cell, it's all the cells in that row and column gets affected. Alright. So if you were asked to um, describe what is a formula, what would you say? You were asked to give a definition or describe a formula. Letitia, I don't hear from you for quite a while now. The formula is a command used to help with calculations. Take out the word command and replace it with something else.
Sir, an equation.
An equation. Good, that is it. A formula is basically an equation that will allow you to carry out your calculation. So just like in maths where you have to create an equation to carry out a certain calculation, a formula is just that. So what is a function now?
Sir, a function is a built-in mathematical formula.
Good, very good. So that formula, or you can say that equation, is built into the function. So that's the difference between the two. The formula, you have to create the equation to get it to work, whereas a function, that equation is already built into the function. So that's how you can remember the difference. They're different, but yet still, you can call a function a formula. Because remember, it still has an equation. It starts with the equal sign, it's carry out calculation. But you cannot call a formula a function. Nothing is built into it. Good. What were some common functions we looked at last time?
Sir, sum
Good.
Average.
Average.
Average,
Math.
max,
and
A
min.
min.
and min. Very good. So those were the common ones that we looked at. There's a lot more out there because remember I showed you that whenever you press equal and a letter, you have a whole bunch of functions that shows up here. But we don't have to learn all of them. There's just a few that we are required to learn, and we're gonna get into that. And the last thing we looked at was autofill. Can anybody tell me what is autofill?
Sir, autofill is basically an easier method for copying formulas.
Easier method of copying formulas. Okay. I don't want to
But
click.
Sir,
only
what is
for
it?
adjacent cells.
Good. Good. Anyone else? What is it? Good. So I don't want to describe it as an easier method. Yes, it is easier, but the key thing to remember is that it copies to adjacent cells. So if you want to copy it so like somewhere in another location, then autofill will not work because autofill is just for copying to cells that are right next to each other. If you're working with a table and you want to copy a cell, that's going to be quick and easy for you to do. But if you're going to work with another part of the spreadsheet or you're going to work with a totally different sheet, then autofill won't be that method for you. You're going to have to use the regular copy and paste. But you can say it's an easy method when you want to copy um, cells that are adjacent to each other. Then that is going to be correct. Let's see. Yes, I think that is about it that we covered last week or this week, whenever it was our last class. The last question is, how do you use autofill? How do you use autofill?
So you click on the cell with the data that you want to copy, and on the right hand bottom corner of the cell has a small circle or dot that you drag onto the cells you wanted to copy.
Very good, very good. That is correct. So you click on the cell, whatever cell you want to copy, and the bottom right of that active cell has a small square that you click on and you drag in whatever adjacent direction you want it to go in. So if we have a 1 there and we click and we drag, it gets copied in whatever adjacent direction we want it to go in. Good. Very good on that. So let's continue with 7.2. So we're going to be starting today with cell ranges, and then we're going to look at naming our ranges. Why is that important? And then we're going to finish off with title locking. Alright, so Jasmine, can you start the reading for us? Cell ranges. Jasmine Primo.
Cell ranges. Often while working in Excel, you may need to select more than one cell. A range is a group of cells that form a rectangle on the screen. In Excel, there are several ways to select a range using the mouse. Drag across adjacent cells, make the first cell of a range active, hold down the Shift key, and click the last cell needed to complete the range. Use Edit or Select All or CTRL A if you need to select everything within a worksheet. Click on row headings or row number to select an entire row. Click on column headings or column letter to select the entire column.
Good. So we have a definition here of the term range, and we already covered it already. But a range refers to a group of cells. So you can see a range, a block range. It basically refers to a group of cells or cells that you would have highlighted, whatever the case you want to phrase it, but it is a group of cells. Now, how do you highlight, how do you select a group of cells? Well, we have several methods here that we can do so. So we have the drag method. So you would have been seeing me doing that for quite a while now. Whenever you click somewhere, whenever you click some cell and make it active, if you click on it again and start dragging, you are highlighting a range of cells. So this is the drag method that you see in here. Now, we can also use the keyboard. We can use the Shift key. So basically, you make a cell active because some persons, they don't have the ability to click on a cell and actually drag and do this here. Some persons kind of find it difficult to use a mouse like this. So for those persons, they can select a cell, make it active, hold the Shift key, and basically select where they want. So they don't have to click and drag, and then they end up clicking somewhere accidentally and highlighting something accidentally. So you simply click the cell that you want to start from, you make that active, you hold the Shift key, and you select wherever you want to highlight. So that can be more simpler. Now, we have another shortcut here, Ctrl and A. You can add this to your shortcut list. I think I would have given you a list of other shortcuts. So Ctrl and A, but you guys should be familiar with this one. When you're copying somebody's assignment, you open it and you do Ctrl and A, you highlight everything. And then which shortcut comes after that?
Ctrl C.
Ctrl C, good. And then you move over to the other document and you do Ctrl V. So Ctrl A highlights all of the cells. So this highlights all of the cells in your worksheet. Now, it's useful. So some of you might be wondering, why would we need to highlight all of the cells in the worksheet? Well, it's useful if you want to maybe delete everything in the worksheet. So if you highlight everything and then you press the backspace or delete key, you can clean your spreadsheet of any data it has, anything inside of it. Or Say for example, you also want to format your spreadsheet. I highlighted everything, so now I can change the font, I can change the font size. That's something to note about spreadsheet, that whatever you highlight, whatever cells you highlight, the format you change applies to all of those cells. So if I use yellow here, it actually turned all of the cells yellow. So whatever format you apply to highlighted cells, it applies to all of them. So it can be useful for that. And if you want to highlight an entire row or an entire column, you basically click on the heading on the name. So for example, if I want to highlight the H column, you click on that, the K column, the N column, it actually highlighting the entire column. So if you want to highlight the entire row also, it's the same. You simply click on the name. So you can highlight on a specific range of cells that you want. You can highlight a specific row, you can highlight a specific column, or you can highlight all of the cells. It all depends on what you basically need. So as you work in your spreadsheet, you're going to find that there are reasons as to why you're going to want to do that. And remembering your methods can help you along that way. Alright, so next we're going to move on to so basically we can also use the keyboard to select our cells. We have the keys of shift and arrow key. So if you don't want to use your mouse, so we already know that if we use the arrow keys on the keyboard, we can move around inside of the spreadsheet. I'm using the arrow keys on my keyboard, so I get a more accurate movement to whatever cell I want. Now if you hold the shift key at whatever position you're going to start from, you can highlight cells also with the keyboard keys, so you don't have to use the mouse. So that is shift and the arrow keys. You hold shift and you use the arrow keys that you want in whatever direction. Now we have shift and space bar, control and space bar. So shift and space bar is for an entire row. Well, it all depends upon the active cell. So shift and space bar is going to highlight that row that has the active cell. Wherever you make that active cell, shift and space bar is going to highlight that entire row, and control and space bar is going to highlight the entire column of wherever you have that active cell. So some persons, when they're working on a computer, especially like if they're typing data, they try to stay on the keyboard. So remembering those shortcuts can help you to stay on the keyboard instead of constantly going back and forth between keyboard and mouse, which can over time maybe cause injury to your hand. So those are two shortcuts there. Now this is very important to remember. How do we select non-adjacent cells? Because if you notice so far, whenever we're highlighting, it's always adjacent cells, cells that are next to each other. So what if we want to highlight non-adjacent cells? Well, in that case, we are going to use the Ctrl key. So Ctrl is going to help us to select what cells we basically want. So for this, I'm going to start off with the mouse method, the clicking and dragging. So you basically hold the Control key and you select what you want. So notice I'm still holding the Control key and I can select cells that are non-adjacent. So This is going to be useful later on in cases where you have to create a chart. Some charts require that you don't select certain data to put in the chart. So knowing how to select basically cells that are not next to each other, that are non-adjacent, is going to help you with that area. So the regular highlighting highlights cells right next to each other that are adjacent. Shift key does that also. But if you do not want to select right next to each other, you can use Control. You hold the Control key and you basically select wherever you want. So you can drag or you can even click. So all of those gray areas are all highlighted. Good. Are you guys following so far?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
Yes,
sir.
sir. Yes, sir.
Alright, great. So next we're going to go on to naming cell ranges. We're going to look at why would we want to name cell ranges even though cells have names. All of our cells have names. J11, R6, even though they have names, why would we still want to rename them basically? Alright, so our next reader, Jasmine, the other Jasmine, can you read for us?
Naming cell ranges. Your selected range produces an address which includes the upper left cell address and the lower right cell address separated by a colon. In figure 7.14, the range address of the selected cells is A2, A7. If you have to use a range option, you should name the range. Click in the name box, type a meaningful message, such as language in figure 7.14, and press enter. Continue.
Yes.
The idea of range names is to make areas of the worksheet easier to work with. Just as you give a file, where does it continue? A name that means something to you. So you should give ranges meaningful names. Once you have named a range, you can select it by clicking on the arrow next to the name box.
Good. And Joshua, can you continue the reading? Alright. We're going to come to that part. Let me look at this part here and then we can come to that. So why do we want to name our ranges? Or basically what we're going to look at first is what is the name of a range? Well, the name of a range, so remember a range is what you highlight, all of those cells that you highlight. So remember I would have said that the top left cell is basically the name because that is the starting point. That is where in a range, that is where the data is going to be located. That's where it's going to start from. But that's when you do a merge and center. It takes up that first leftmost cell when you group all of them together. But with a range, we basically have to say what is the starting point and what is the ending point. So that is going to be the upper left cell and the lower right cell address. So the upper left cell and the lower right cell. So that is going to give us, so upper left, the top here, and the bottom right. That is going to give us the entire range that we would have selected and whatever data is inside of it. And it is separated by a colon. So we have an example here. We have A2 colon A7. So how we would say this we would normally say A2 to A7. So the colon, we would say it to, because technically it is A2 to A7. The colon is representing everything that is in between. So whenever we see a range, for example, B colon C7, that means we would have highlighted from B2 to cell C7. So let's look at an example of why we would want to use a range in the first place. So I'm going to put a bunch of 4s here. Good. So I'm creating a formula. I'm creating a formula. Can any one of you help me to create a formula to add all of these numbers? What do I start with?
So you can use a function.
Function, okay.
Yeah.
But
Equal.
I want to create the formula first.
So start with an equal sign.
So equal sign and what else?
E1.
E1.
Colon.
Colon.
E6.
E6. Okay. I like what you're thinking. But that's, if you notice, that's not gonna work because we don't have any operators here.
Yes.
So, I like how you're thinking. But if it was to be a normal formula, it would have been E1 plus E2, right? Plus E3 plus E4 plus E5 plus E6. Correct? Everybody following there?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
So if we wanted to create a formula, this is basically how it's going to look. And if you notice just now, I typed in a common E. So it doesn't matter how you type it in. It's not case sensitive. So if you're going to create a formula, this is how it's going to look. Now, if we had more information, if it was going down more, then this is going to be a very lengthy formula. So this is where functions and ranges comes into play. Now, if you notice that technically we could not have added the range. So even if we do, say for example, E1 colon plus that, I think it's still, no, it's not going to allow you to, it's not going to work because it was not going to detect it. So using a range in a regular formula is not going to work. So you need to use it basically in a function. So we're going to use the sum function. Now in the sum function, we could still do it the same way. We could do E1 colon comma E2 comma E3 comma E4 comma and so on. We can do it like that also, and it's going to work. But is that effective? What if we have more cells? Is that an effective method? Well, no, that is not the most effective method. So in this case here, we can use our range. So remember, we just looked at how do we know the name of a range? Is it top left cell, the upper left cell, colon, the lower right cell. So in this case here, top left is going to be E1 and bottom right is going to be E6. And we put our colon in the middle and we have our calculation there. So notice it's the same answer, but we made our formula, we made our function a lot simpler. So if there was more data like that, and if we wanted to calculate that with this formula, we have to put in each one of these individually. So you can say formulas are basically for more simple equations where you don't have to type in a lot of cells. But a function is going to be useful when you have to use a lot of cells. So what is going to be the range here? E1 to
H6.
H6, very good. So that's going to highlight, notice it highlighted everything. The top left, E1, and the bottom left, H6. And when you complete that, you have your answer of 96. So I noticed the difference. It is still small. It is still a small formula that any person can look at and be able to understand. But if we had compared it to this one here, we'd have to type plus that cell plus that cell plus that cell, and it's going to make it lengthy and complicated. So each has its use case, and each has its positives and its negative. So that is how you basically make use of a range. Now, say for example, so we know that this is basically the name of the range. The first cell, first top left cell, and the last bottom right cell. That is the name of the range. Now, there are cases where you're going to constantly reuse a range. And what can happen is that you might forget that this is the name of the range, because as humans, this is not a name that might be familiar to us. We only remember things that are basically familiar to us. A plant name, name of a person, those are kind of familiar to us. So, but remembering E1 colon 86, or if we had by E 32 colon H MMN 43, that is a range, but you might not remember it because it's not something that easy to remember. So in those cases, what you can do if you're gonna regularly use a range, so if you're gonna use a range often, it would make sense for you to name that range. Basically give it a name that you can recognize it by. So I'm not saying like give it a name that you're gonna name this range John, and you're gonna name this range Mark, and that range is gonna name Suzanne. No. Whenever you're naming something in IT, this is gonna be a rule basically throughout IT. Whenever you are naming something, it must be meaningful. When we say it's meaningful, it basically must represent the data, whatever we have in that range. So for example, if in the range we have a bunch of languages, then obviously the name of that range should be language. Or we could have even breaking it down more and say names of languages. So whatever we are naming something, it must be specific, it must be clear, it must represent what is in the range. So for example, let me see. So how do we name a range? So let's look at that now. How do we name a range? Well, remember the top left here, we have our name box. So this can tell us what is the name of a cell, and it can also function as renaming the cells or the cell ranges. So to rename a range, you simply highlight that range. So you have to highlight that exact range that you want to name. After you've highlighted that range, you go to the name box, you delete what is inside of the name box, and you type in the name that you want. So in this case, I'm going to type in numbers. So I've just named this range numbers. So if you notice, as I'm highlighting, as I highlight this part here, it says E1 in the name box. But if I highlight back the range, notice the range name appears. It appears as numbers. So it actually, but if you notice, even though I renamed that range, this formula is still working. I'm still getting my answer of 96. E1 to H6 is that same numbers range, and this formula here is still working. That's because we didn't really delete the name of E1 to H6. That name still exists, but just that you can say it's like we're giving it a nickname, something that we can remember it by. So the same common range name of whatever the cells are, that's still going to work, but we're giving it a common name that we are going to remember. So we're going to create another function, and in this function here, compared to the one that we have above, so in this function we have equals sum, and in bracket we have the range E1 to H6. So in this function here, equals sum, open bracket. Can anybody make a guess what we're going to be typing next? What do you think we're going to type next?
Sir, are you gonna type numbers because you named the thing?
Exactly. We're going to type it numbers because we named that range numbers. So even if you notice at the bottom here, remember functions show up here when we type in. But if you notice, we have a slightly different icon here. You basically have like a grid and two cells highlighted indicating a range. So this here is a name for a range. If we had more names, if we had created more ranges, we would have seen them shown up here. So we can also double click on it, and it's going to add in that range name, and we complete our function and we have our answer there. So let me turn on that. So notice we have two different functions, two different formulas that we created here. One has E1, H6, one has numbers, and they both function the same way. They both gave us the same answer. So whenever you move throughout your spreadsheet, you can use this name because it's going to be easier for you to remember. Now, there's some additional benefits to naming a range, but let me ask a question before we move on to that. So if we can name a range, do you guys think we can name a cell? Can we name one cell? What do you think? No one?
Sir, I think you can, but then it wouldn't make sense. Like, why rename a cell a single cell? That doesn't make sense.
Okay, good. I like your thinking. So yes, you can rename a single cell, and you might be wondering, why would we want to rename just one cell? I'm going to give you a few examples as to why that would be necessary. So where were we? We were looking at ranges. Okay, so let me come back. I'll come back to naming cells. What I want to look at first though is why would we want to name our ranges? Or let me show you how to give you an example of naming a cell, and then we look at that. So say for example, you want to do a calculation on, say you have items, so you have a chair, you have a desk, and you have the cost. So you bought a chair for 34,000, you bought a chair for 51,000. So you want to calculate the VAT for that chair. So we know that VAT has a standard percentage. So we can actually put it aside, say for example VAT, and say that VAT is 40%. So it's basically in spreadsheet, once you have, like for example, a standard value, you would usually try to put it in a cell by itself. So when you're creating a formula, instead of doing this cell here multiplied by 40% in the formula, which is still going to give you the correct answer, remember, a more effective formula is going to use cell addresses. So that's why you would type it in another cell, reference that cell, and reference that cell, and you have your correct answer. So if, for instance, the VAT was to change for some reason, it dropped to 4%, you can easily change it and it would recalculate. So if you're ever going to use a single value repeatedly in a formula, type it into a cell and reference that cell. Good. So now in this case here, if we were to actually autofill, our formula is not going to work. There's a reason for this, and it's a bit technical, and it's a topic that we're going to look at later on. But if we actually want it to work, we would actually need to name the cell. So for example, we can name it VAT, so that in the calculation, in the formula, we use VAT, so that when we autofill the formula, we have our calculation. So whenever we want to use a single cell constantly, it's going to be more effective to name that cell also, because you're going to remember it and it's going to be easier for you to reference later on. Now that's one reason as to why you would want to use rename a single cell. This is an example here. So if it's going to be a common use cell, it's going to be beneficial to you to rename it. Now in general, now why would you want to use names? So in general, now why would you want to name a range? Why would you want to name a cell? Well, if you notice, each one of these sheets, even those cells, the name of a cell must be unique. Have any of you noticed that in each sheet there's an A1, and in each sheet there's a B2? Any of you notice that? Any of you ever realize that? Cells have to be unique, but yet at the same time, each sheet has a A1, each sheet has a B2, each sheet has the same name as cells, but yet still everything works. Well, you can say in that case, what is happening is that these cell names are restricted to the sheet. So this A1 does not go outside of this sheet here to A2, to sheet 2 and sheet 3. The name stays within the sheet, because if it was to go out, it would conflict with this A1, and it would conflict with this A1 in sheet 3. So cell names, they don't go beyond the sheet, because it can conflict with other sheets. Other sheets have the same name. Now, range names are not limited by the sheets. So that same range of numbers, I can actually go to a totally other different sheet, and I could create that function right here, and I can use that same range, and I have my answer there. So 96, and I also have 96 over here. If I change the values, 857, over here it's 857 also. So I have my function, my formula here, and it's using the range from that sheet. So that is the effectiveness, the benefit of naming a range. If there's a common range in one sheet, you don't have to go and copy that range and paste it into another sheet and give it another name. Because remember, you won't be able to give it that same name. It's going to conflict. Range names, they go beyond the sheet. So even if you copied it over here, even if you copy the sheet to copy that data to another sheet, and you try to go and name it, say for instance you didn't know, and you want to use that range inside of this sheet, look what's actually going to happen. When you type in numbers, notice it's not going to rename it, but it's going to take you to the location of the numbers range. So two things is actually happening here. One, it's preventing you from naming a range the same name, because we cannot have the same name. And two, it is locating a range. So that's the benefit of this name box here. It allows you to locate a range. So if you notice, there's this drop down arrow here. If you click on it, you're going to see all of the name ranges that you would have created. So if you click on VAT, it's going to take us to that VAT range. If you click on numbers, it's going to take us to that number range. It doesn't matter what sheet we're in. If I click on VAT, it's going to take me to VAT. If I'm in sheet 3 and I click on numbers, it's going to take me to numbers. And if you type in the name once again, if I type in VAT, so they say for instance, I had typed 15% here, and I wanted to name this VAT. If I type in VAT, it's going to take me to the location of that name already. So if you want to name this also, you're going to have to give it a new name. So for instance, you might have to name it VAT1. But notice what happened there. VAT and the number 1 is actually already a name of a cell. So notice it took me to VAT1, which is already the name of the cell. So it's a mechanism that can prevent you from naming cells the same name. That name box there. So it doesn't only allow you to name your cells, name your ranges, it also helps you to locate a cell or a range. So actually, if you want to go directly to a cell, you can actually type in that name. For example, if you want to go to DAF 34, we're at cell DAF 34. Or if you want to go down further, 3456, we're at DAF 3456. So those are some of the use cases of the name box there. Are you guys following with all of that? We looked at a lot of things there.
Yes, sir.
Anyone wants me to go back anything? I was going too fast.
No, sir.
Sir, can you go over naming cell ranges, please?
Alright. So naming a cell range, naming a cell, it's the same thing. You basically make it active. So if you want to name a cell, you make it active. If you want to make a range, you highlight those cells and you make it active. So whatever you select, whatever you highlight, you go to the name box and you type in a name. You just delete what was there, whatever showed up there, and you type in whatever name you want to give it, and you press enter. So if I select here, I go to the name box, A3 was automatically highlighted. I type in something, a name, enter, and I just named it there. Highlight some cells, go to the name box, replace it, enter, and we have names there. So if we click on the arrow, we're going to see the names that I just created here. Did that help?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
All right.
sir.
Anybody else? Anything else I was going too fast on? All right, so we were looking at naming the range. That was the main purpose of this, why we're on the sheet. So I just showed you back how to name the range. And I was talking about, I went off about how effective and beneficial a range name is. It is useful because you can use it in other sheets to do your calculation. And then I went on about how we can use the name box to locate a range. So you can either click on the arrow and click on the range to locate it, or you can even type it in, and that is going to go to the name of the range. So remember, the effectiveness or the benefit of a name in a range is so that you can remember it. You can remember the name of that range, the name of that cell, so that you can use it anywhere else. So for example, this VAT here. Say for instance, I was in a totally different sheet and I created another table, items and costs, and I bought a computer and I bought it for that amount of money and I want to calculate VAT. I don't need to type in that, I don't need to recreate that cell anymore. I could simply use the name and it's going to look at that cell, pull the 40% over, and give me my calculation here. So that is the benefit of naming a range. It not only helps you to remember the name, but it also can be used in other cells, other sheets, if you need to carry out calculations. Alright, so the last thing we're going to look at is what are the rules for naming a range. This is very important. These rules are general throughout IT, so it's important for you to remember them. Joshua, can you read for us? Joshua? Jonathan?
Yes, sir. Here are a few rules to follow when naming a range. Range names must begin with a letter. Range names cannot have the same name as the cell address. Range names cannot contain spaces. Use uppercase first letters, an underscore or a full stop to separate words. Range names cannot contain special characters such as hyphen, $signs, person signs, ampersand, or number signs. Range names cannot contain special characters such as range names should contain less than 256 characters. Keep in mind that the idea of using range names is for identification. Use names that are simple yet recognizable or related to the data they rip.
Good. So these rules, you're going to be using them throughout IT. Whenever you're naming something in IT, you begin with a letter. So in addition to that, it cannot have the same name as other names as we just looked at. The cells cannot have the same name. So when we looked at other areas in IT, for example, database and programs, there's other elements that we might name. So we cannot give them the same name because they're going to conflict with each other. Now you cannot put spaces in, you can put spaces, but you should not. You can put spaces, but you should not put spaces. because it's going to basically detect it as multiple words, because obviously it is multiple words. It's not going to combine it together and consider it a whole name. So whenever you're naming something, you do not use spaces. So say for example, you're going to use the name prime numbers. So this here is incorrect. That there is incorrect. We do not use spaces. So the correct method is going to be to do prime on prime numbers, no spaces. You can make the second word, the first letter, capital, or you can do prime underscore numbers, or you can do prime dot numbers. Any one of these three methods here is correct, but you do not use spaces. Um, we do not use special characters also, because sometimes the system doesn't recognize special characters. We have to stay less than 256 characters. And lastly, remember, names are used for identification. So even though there can be multiple Jadas and there can be multiple Jonathans, that won't affect anything in the real world. A lot of persons have the same first name, same last name. That doesn't really affect anything. But in computer land, it will affect your program. It will affect the software, because it cannot differentiate between the two. We can look at the person, differentiate that this is Jada 1, this is Jada 2. But in a software, if something is going to have the same name, it cannot differentiate between it. So that's why we cannot have the same name. And at the same time, whenever we're naming something, it must be accurate, it must be direct, it must represent that data. So for example, when I named that range numbers, that was an ineffective name, because you can ask yourself, what kind of numbers? Is it supposed to be prime numbers? Is it supposed to be whole numbers, real numbers, fractions? What kind of numbers is it supposed to be? So keep that in mind. Whenever you're naming something, it must be exactly what is inside of this cell. Like for example, when I name this cell here VAT, I could have also named it VAT percentage or VAT1 percentage, something that would clearly tell me that it is the percentage for VAT. Alright, so to wrap up what we looked at today, we looked at cell ranges, how we can name our cells. We looked at how we can select our cells. We have quite a few methods. We can use the shortcut, we can use our mouse, we can use our keyboard. Very important to remember that out of all of them is the Ctrl key, to be used for non-adjacent cells. We looked at all the reasons why we would want to name a cell, name a range, and what is the name of a range. The first cell, colon, and the last cell. And then we looked at the rules for naming a cell or a range. Now, title locking, we're going to look at that next week. I want you guys to do all of these questions for next week. So this is going to be your homework. Complete all of these questions. We are going to review it at the beginning of the class. So please ensure you do that. Alright, so we're going to close off here for today. If you guys don't have any questions on anything we looked at for today, enjoy the rest of your day.